Chapter 16 Part 1 of 2. What about hell? Howard Storm, professor of art at Northern Kentucky University, was taking students on a tour of Paris's museums when a stomach ulcer perforated his duodenum. Little did he know, but from the time of perforation, life expectancy typically lasted 5 hours. The hospital had only one surgeon on duty that weekend, so he and his wife, Beverly, had to wait. 10 hours later, a nurse informed them the doctor had gone home, and they would have to wait until morning. Howard had fought to stay alive, but now he had nothing left. I knew I was dying now. Fighting against a flood of tears, I told Beverly that I loved her very much. I told her it was over. We said our goodbyes. I knew for certain that there was no such thing as life after death. Only simple-minded people believed in that sort of thing. I didn't believe in God, or heaven, or hell, or any other fairy tales. Howard closed his eyes and passed. He expected oblivion, but instead, he found himself standing up beside the bed. He opened his eyes. Could this be a dream? I kept thinking. This has got to be a dream. But I knew that it wasn't. I was aware that I felt more alert, more aware, and more alive than I had ever felt in my entire life. All my senses were extremely vivid. As I bent over to look at the face of the body in the bed, I was horrified to see the resemblance that it had to my own face. It was impossible that that thing could be me because I was standing over it and looking at it. I had never felt more alert and conscious. I wanted desperately to get through to Beverly, and I started yelling for her to say something, but she remained frozen in the chair next to the bed. I screamed and raged at her, but she just ignored me. Off in the distance, outside the room in the hall, I heard voices calling me. Howard, Howard, they were calling. They were pleasant voices, male and female, young and old, calling me in English. None of the hospital staff spoke English so clearly. Come out here, they said. Let's go, hurry up. We've been waiting for you for a long time. I can't, I said. I'm sick. I need an operation. I am very sick. We can get you fixed up, they said. If you hurry up. Don't you want to get better? Don't you want help? I was in an unknown hospital in a foreign country, in an extremely bizarre situation, and I was afraid of those people calling me. They were irritated by my questions, which were only attempts to find out who they were. We can't help you if you don't come out here. I stepped out into the hall, full of anxiety. The area seemed to be light but very hazy, like being in a plane passing through thick clouds. The people were off in the distance and I couldn't see them very clearly. But I could tell that they were male and female, tall and short, old and young adults. As I tried to get close to them to identify them, they quickly withdrew deeper into the fog. So I had to follow farther and farther into the thick atmosphere. I could never get closer to them than 10 feet. I had lots of questions. Every time I hesitated, they demanded that I keep up. They continued to repeat the promise that if I followed them, my troubles would end. We walked on, and my repeated inquiries were rebuffed. I knew that we had been traveling for miles, but I had the strange ability to occasionally look back and see through the doorway of the hospital room. Beverly was sitting there as frozen as she had been when this surreal experience first began. It seemed many miles away, but I could still see it off in the distance. I also couldn't make out how much time was passing. There was a profound sense of timelessness. I kept asking when we were going to get there. I'm sick, I said. I can't do this. They became increasingly angry and sarcastic. If you'd quit moaning and groaning, we'd get there, they said. Move it, let's go, hurry up. The more questioning and suspicious I became, the more antagonistic and authoritarian they became. They were whispering about my bare rear end, which wasn't covered by my hospital gown, and about how pathetic I was. I knew they were talking about me, but when I tried to hear exactly what they were saying, they would say to one another, "Shoo, he can hear you, he can hear you." What was increasingly clear to me was that they were deceiving me. The longer I stayed with them, the further away escape would be. They began shouting and hurling insults at me, demanding that I hurry along. The more miserable I became, the more enjoyment they derived from my distress. A terrible sense of dread was growing within me. This experience was too real. In some ways I was more aware and sensitive than I had ever been. When I looked around, I was horrified to discover that we were in complete darkness. The hopelessness of my situation overwhelmed me. I told them I would go no farther, to leave me alone. Then they began to push and shove me about. I began to fight back. A wild frenzy of taunting, screaming, and hitting ensued. I fought like a wild man. As I swung and kicked at them, they bit and tore back at me. All the while it was obvious that they were having great fun. Even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness, I was aware that there were dozens or hundreds of them all around and over me. My attempts to fight back only provoked greater merriment. Every new assault brought howls of cacophonous laughter. They began to tear off pieces of my flesh. To my horror, I realized that I was being taken apart and eaten alive, methodically, slowly, so that their entertainment would last as long as possible. These creatures were once human beings. The best way I can describe them is to think of the worst imaginable person stripped of every impulse of compassion. They were a mob of beings totally driven by unbridled cruelty. In that darkness I had intense physical contact with them when they swarmed over me. Their bodies felt exactly as human bodies. Eventually I became too badly torn up and too broken to resist. Most of them gave up tormenting me because I was no longer amusing. I haven't described everything that happened. There are things that I don't care to remember. In fact, much that occurred was simply too gruesome and disturbing to recall. I've spent years trying to suppress a lot of it. After the experience, whenever I did remember those details, I would become traumatized. As I lay on the ground, my tormentors swarming around me, a voice emerged from my chest. It sounded like my voice, but it wasn't a thought of mine. Pray to God. I remember thinking, why? What a stupid idea. That doesn't work. What a cop-out. Lying here in this darkness, surrounded by hideous creatures, I don't believe in God. This is utterly hopeless, and I am beyond any possible help whether I believe in God or not. I don't pray, period. A second time, the voice spoke to me, pray to God. It was recognizably my voice, but I had not spoken. Pray how? Pray what? I hadn't prayed at any time in my entire adult life. I didn't know how to pray. That voice said it again, pray to God. Howard struggled to remember any prayers from childhood, anything with God's name in it, so he just pieced together all he could recall into a ragtag prayer of desperation. Yeah, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. For purple mountain majesty, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Deliver us from evil. One nation under God. God bless America. To my amazement, the cruel, merciless beings tearing the life out of me were incited to rage by my ragged prayer. It was as if I were throwing boiling oil on them. They screamed at me, there is no God. Who do you think you're talking to? Nobody can hear you. Now we are really going to hurt you. They spoke in the most obscene language, worse than any blasphemy said on earth. But at the same time, they were backing away. I could still hear their voices in the utter darkness, but they were getting more and more distant. I realized that saying things about God was actually driving them away. I became a little more forceful with what I was saying. I knew they were far away but could return. I was alone, destroyed, and yet painfully alive in this revoltingly horrible place. I had no idea where I was. I was alone in that darkness for time without measure. I thought about what I had done. All my life I had thought that hard work was what counted. My life was devoted to building a monument to my ego. My family, my sculptures, my painting, my house, my gardens, my little fame, my illusions of power, were all an extension of my ego. All of those things were gone now, and what did they matter? All of my life, I'd fought a constant undertone of anxiety, fear, dread, and angst. If I could become famous, I could defeat powerlessness and beat death. I didn't belong to any clubs or organizations. In spite of the narcissistic appearance, I didn't like myself, and I didn't like other people either. How ironic it was to end up in the sewer of the universe with people who fed off the pain of others. I had had little genuine compassion for others. It dawned on me that I was not unlike these miserable creatures that had tormented me. Little strength was left to resist becoming a creature gnashing his teeth in the outer darkness. I wasn't far from becoming like one of my own tormentors for all eternity. As Howard lay alone in the dark, feeling himself slipping away into hopelessness, a song he hadn't heard since childhood came into his head, Jesus loves me, duh, duh, duh. He could remember but 3 words, yet it tapped deep into a longing and ignited a tiny spark of hope. I wanted it to be true that Jesus loved me. I didn't know how to express what I wanted and needed, but with every bit of my last ounce of strength, I yelled out into the darkness, Jesus, save me. I have never met anything more strongly in my life. Far off in the darkness I saw a pinpoint of light like the faintest star in the sky. The star was rapidly getting brighter and brighter. The light was more intense and more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. It was brighter than the sun, brighter than a flash of lightning. Soon the light was upon me. I knew that while it was indescribably brilliant, it wasn't just light. This was a living being, a luminous being, surrounded by an oval of radiance. The brilliant intensity of the light penetrated my body. Ecstasy swept away the agony. Tangible hands and arms gently embraced me and lifted me up. I slowly rose up into the presence of the light, and the torn pieces of my body miraculously healed before my eyes. This loving, luminous being who embraced me knew me intimately. He knew me better than I knew myself. He was knowledge and wisdom. I knew that he knew everything about me. I was unconditionally loved and accepted. He was King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Christ Jesus the Savior. Jesus does love me, I thought. I had called out to Jesus and he came to rescue me. I cried and cried from joy, and the tears kept coming. Joy upon joy billowed through me. He held me and caressed me like a mother with her baby, like a father with his long-lost prodigal son. I cried all the tears of a lifetime of hopelessness and tears of shame over my unbelief. I cried all the tears of joy and salvation. I cried like a baby and couldn't stop crying. He held me close and stroked my back. We rose upward, gradually at first, and then like a rocket we shot out of that dark and detestable hell. We traversed an enormous distance, light years, although very little time elapsed. Off in the distance far, far away, I saw a vast area of illumination that looked like a galaxy. In the center was an enormously bright concentration of light. Outside the center, countless millions of spheres of light were flying about, entering and leaving that great concentration of light at the center. While moving toward the presence of the great light, center of all being, the One, I was beyond thought. It is not possible to articulate what occurred. Simply, I knew that God loved me, that God loved creation, that God is love. 1 Hellish NDEs. As he looked far across space to this great city of light, Howard said he had a life review in the presence of Jesus and several angels, which we will explore in the next chapter. Howard revived, miraculously, and several years later left his career as a university professor and chairman of the art department to become a pastor. What would motivate an avowed atheist professor to give up tenure and his life's work to make up a story of visiting hell? We could write it off if this were the only NDE story like this, but there are many. In the 1970s, when NDE reports were increasing, very few if any persons experiencing hellish NDEs came forward. In fact, Moody boldly stated, "No one has described the cartoonist's heaven of pearly gates, golden streets, nor a hell of flames and demons with pitchforks." So, in most cases, the reward-punishment model of the afterlife is abandoned and disavowed. But Moody's declaration was overcharacterized and premature. Dutch researcher Dr. Pim van Lommel summarizes hellish NDEs. To their horror, they sometimes find themselves pulled even deeper into the profound darkness. The NDE ends in this scary atmosphere. Such a terrifying NDE usually produces long-lasting emotional trauma. Not surprisingly, it is also known as a hell experience. The exact number of people who experience such a frightening NDE is unknown because they often keep quiet out of shame and guilt. 3 Sartori notes, research has served to highlight that negative NDEs are just as real as the pleasant ones and can occur in the absence of anesthetics. For some studies produced no distressing NDEs, but this may result from how the study was conducted. Studies asking for people to come forward if they've had an NDE will produce people excited to tell others of a good experience. As Howard Storm found, over the years many people have shared their near-death experiences with me, many of which were negative experiences. Many of these people have told me that they have not really shared their experiences with anyone because of the shame and ridicule they felt. These are not uncommon, but it is highly unlikely that anyone will hear about them. 5 Frequency of hellish NDEs. Despite that, the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences reports that 12 different studies involving 1,369 subjects found that 23% reported NDEs ranging from disturbing to terrifying or despairing. 6 Dr. Rawlings, the cardiologist from Chapter 3, revived a patient having multiple hellish experiences that the patient could not recall afterward. Rawlings postulates that these experiences produce such trauma that they get suppressed in the subconscious mind, and unless a patient is interviewed immediately after resuscitation, we should not expect as many accounts to come forward. 7 Rawlings quotes other doctors reporting a similar blocked memory response. A 14-year-old girl became despondent over her life and decided to end it. She swallowed a bottle of aspirin. In the hospital, the doctor reported resuscitating her from a cardiac arrest, during which she kept saying, "Mama, help me. Make them let me go. They're trying to hurt me." The doctors tried to apologize for hurting her, but she said it wasn't the doctors, but them, those demons in hell. They wouldn't let go of me, it was just awful. The doctor reports, she slept for another day, and her mother hugged her most of the time. After the various tubes were removed, I asked her to recall what had happened. She remembered taking the aspirin, but absolutely nothing else. Somewhere in her mind, the events may still be suppressed. She subsequently became a missionary several years later. 8 Similarly, in other cultures, not all NDEs are pleasant. In India, Yamduts are considered messengers like angels. Yamduts are supposed to appear at the bedside of the dying to take them away to their lord, Yamaraj, the god of death. The appearance of the Yamdut depends upon the karma of the patient. If he has accumulated good deeds, a pleasant Yamdut appears, but if he has not acquitted himself well in his lifetime, a fearful Yamdut might come. 9 A Hindu clerical worker said, "Somebody is standing there. He has a cart with him, so he must be a Yamdut. He must be taking someone with him. He is teasing me that he's going to take me. Please hold me, I'm not going." 10 His pain increased and he died. Osis and Haraldson report, 1 out of every 3, 34%, Indians who experienced the takeaway hallucination refused to consent, were afraid of the Yamdut coming to take them away. 11 Enough hellish accounts have been documented for researchers to categorize them into 3 categories that I'm labeling the void, hell on earth, and the pit. The void: some NDers find themselves leaving their bodies but either entering a void like they are somewhere in outer space or experiencing a falling sensation through outer darkness. Gary was a young artist who lost control of his car on a snowy winter evening. He described leaving his body and watching as icy water filled the car. "I saw the ambulance coming, and I saw the people trying to help me, get me out of the car and to the hospital. At that time I was no longer in my body. I had left my body. I was probably 100 or 200 feet up and to the south of the accident, and I felt the warmth and the kindness of the people trying to help me. I also felt the source of all that kind of kindness or whatever, and it was very, very powerful, and I was afraid of it, and so I didn't accept it. I just said no. I was very uncertain about it, and I didn't feel comfortable, and so I rejected it. And it was at that moment that I left the planet. I could feel myself and see myself going way, way up into the air, then beyond the solar system, beyond the galaxy, and out beyond anything physical. It became unbearable, it became horrific, as time goes on when you have no feeling, no sensation, no sense of light. I started to panic and struggle and pray and everything I could think of to struggle to get back. 12 Some reject the love or light of God, or like air, they experience the light as painful or they want to resist it. Others simply find themselves in a void that becomes terrifying, others experience an outer darkness often accompanied by a falling sensation. My friend Paul Ojeda died of a cocaine overdose and found himself suddenly sober, but in a situation he never expected. He explained to me what happened. "When I died, I didn't see a light, I saw a black tunnel like someone had dropped me into an outer darkness and I was free falling. I realized I was no longer high. I was in a different place and there was a different sense of time, but I was rapidly going deep into this and I thought, I'm a good person, I shouldn't be going here. But nothing made it stop, and I realized I'm going to hell, and I'm not going to get out of here. That's when I cried out, 'Please Lord, I don't want to go to this place, please save me.' I didn't see a face or a figure, I just felt the presence of the Lord beside me, and he asked in my spirit, 'Paul, what have you done with the life I've given you?' Paul saw his entire life play out before him from birth to 30, his age at that time, and God revealed every hidden dark secret in his heart that nobody knew about except him.